Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Future of the Korean Peninsula, Current Conflict, Future Peace. My name is Kumju Lee. I am a co-president of the New England Korea Peace Campaign and a public school teacher in Brookline, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar discusses the current situation and the future outlook of the Korean Peninsula, where the war has been going on for 70 years. The current situation on the Korean Peninsula raises the question of whether it is heading toward peace and reunification, the long-cherished wish of the 80 million Koreans. In South Korea, the newly elected far-right president is escalating tensions on the peninsula with his preemptive strike remarks. Meanwhile, North Korea is still struggling and isolated due to continued US sanctions and COVID. At the geopolitical level, the war in Ukraine and increased U.S. China tensions have widened schisms on the peninsula. Since the breakdown of the Hanoi summit in February 2019, peace talks between the US and North Korea have remained at a stalemate. On the other hand, North Korea is responding to the US hostile policy toward North Korea by testing nuclear missiles. What should we see in the current situation on the Korean Peninsula? Is there any way to open peace through dialogue and negotiation? What can we do to promote peace on the Korean Peninsula? Today, we'll hear the insights of an expert on the Korea peace issues. We have a very distinguished speaker. Let me introduce today's speaker, Mr. John Feffer. Mr. Feffer is the Director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. He published several fiction and nonfiction books, including North Korea, South Korea, US Policy at a Time of Crisis. And his articles have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, USAToday, and many other publications. This webinar will last about an hour. Mr. Feffer will talk for 30 minutes, and then we'll hold a Q&A session for 25 to 30 minutes. While listening to the talk, please write your questions in the chat. We also have a Korean translation for the PPT available in the chat. So without further ado, Mr. Feffer, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kumju. It's very kind of you to introduce me, and it's very kind of you folks to invite me to speak. I'm not sure I'm going to add much to what you've laid out, Kumju, in your introduction. I will, as you said, talk for about a half an hour. I'm going to share my screen now and go through some slides pretty quickly. And I'm going to start with some of the less favorable trends. I mean, I don't have to tell everyone that this has not been a great year in a lot of different respects. I mean, obviously there's the elections in South Korea. There's continued kind of hardline positions from the United States and Japan. But I'm going to start in a different place, actually, one connected to the other conflict, the one that hasn't been going on for 80 years, but the one in Ukraine. And I'm going to begin by talking about this new alliance that has emerged between Russia and North Korea. And I'm going to use that as really an indicator of how trends have not been favorable. I'm not going to comment on the alliance itself on whether that's favorable or not favorable, but rather as an example of how things have been shifting in the world. So what do I mean by the closer relationship between DPRK and Russia? Well, there have been a couple of examples. I mean, one of the first, of course, is that North Korea has basically supported the Russia after its invasion of Ukraine in February. And it's one of only 3 countries in the world to actually recognize the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass region, others being, of course, Russia and Syria. So that's quite a strong statement for the DPRK to make. Kim Jong-un has also offered, and this is quite surprising, 100,000 troops to fight in the Ukraine war. It's not really clear whether this was either a serious offer in the sense that North Korea would provide 100,000 troops or that Russia would accept 100,000 troops. But in any case, that was one of the offers on the table. The other was to send workers to the Donbass region to help in reconstruction of the area. And of course, those of you who know the history of North Korea know that that would be kind of a return favor. There were a number of Eastern European countries that helped with the reconstruction of North Korea in specific cities after the destruction of the Korean War. And actually sending workers to Russia is also not unprecedented. I mean, there are numbers are difficult to come by, but there are somewhere around 10 to 20,000 North Korean workers in Russia today. But this would just be a different kind of mission, to reconstruction mission. And the other kind of piece of news, which many of you probably have seen in the New York Times, is that Russia is purchasing North Korean artillery, doing so because it needs access to Soviet-era ammunition, and North Korea is one of the few places in the world that actually has that ammunition. What's interesting about this is not the fact that Russia's buying this artillery, but the fact that it feels compelled to go to North Korea to buy it, when there were many who expected China to actually be doing Russia the favor of supplying it with military hardware. And China actually has not done so. China has not gone ahead and recognized the Donbass. China has not broken the sanctions against Russia by delivering either military hardware or high-tech exports. So this is quite an interesting development, in other words, that Russia feels compelled to go to North Korea as well as Iran for some of the military requirements in its war. So why is there a shift in North Korea's strategy? And this is what I'm getting at when I'm bringing this up as an example. Why does the DPRK feel that it's important to back Russia in its current war in Ukraine? Well, I mean, one of the major reasons that North Korea is shifting, and I should mention before going to the South Korean elections, that there is some kind of bad blood between North Korea and Russia that goes back many decades. North Korea is very unhappy with what happened in the 1990s when Russia increased prices for energy. And that was one of the reasons for the economic collapse of the country in the 1990s. Certainly the decline in industry and agriculture was so dependent on relatively inexpensive energy. So there's some bad blood between North Korea and Russia. But as we'll see, there has been also an effort by North Korea to kind of balance its relationship between Russia and China, and in some sense play the two countries off one another. But I think the real kind of groundwork for a stronger relationship between North Korea and Russia is the developments that have taken place in the region and with the United States. First and foremost, the election in South Korea. And I mean, as you've all talked about, I'm sure, Yoon Suk-yeol is a departure from the last 5 years of an engagement policy, and really a sharp return to conservative policies in South Korea of the past. Now, it's not just a sharp return to the conservative and kind of hard line policies. We even see echoes in what Yoon Suk-yeol has proposed as the Audacious plan for sending economic assistance to North Korea. And here I've laid out the steps of the Audacious plan, providing North Korea with a lot of food, enhancing its agricultural productivity, improving healthcare infrastructure, infrastructure improvements and transportation. But importantly, no sanctions relief, in part because South Korea doesn't really have the the ability to provide sanctions relief, and those are either multilateral or largely coming from the United States, although there are some bilateral sanctions between South Korea and North Korea. But what's really interesting about this Audacious plan is it's basically the same as what Lee Myung-bak provided back when Lee Myung-bak was a conservative president of South Korea some 15 or 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, I guess. So, you know, the response by North Korea was basically, well, we've seen this before. It's really not, it's kind of an insult to expect us to accept money effectively in exchange for our independence and for our sovereignty. So North Korea has basically said, no, thank you. We've seen this before. We didn't want it then, and we don't want it now. The other kind of major element of the shift in policy in South Korea, of course, is strengthen U.S. ROK military cooperation, resumption of live fire drills between the two countries. And of course, there's been response in South Korea. Many of you know, though the news hasn't really filtered back here to the United States, but significant demonstrations in Seoul in August against, you know, the resumption of this strengthened U.S. ROK military alliance. My friend and colleague Tim Shorrock has written about it in Responsible Statecraft, but that's basically one of the few places you can read about these anti-war demonstrations in South Korea. So strengthen U.S.-South Korean military cooperation, but then even strengthen U.S.-South Korean-Japanese military cooperation, the so-called trilateral alliance. As you know, conservative politicians in South Korea are more likely to have a favorable attitude toward Japan and cooperation with Japan, both intelligence sharing as well as coordination on military affairs. And Fumio Kishida is, you know, status quo ante when it comes to Japan in terms of his policies, guiding Japan not only towards strengthened trilateral coordination, but also quadrilateral. And for those of you who follow these things, the Quad, kind of an invention during the Trump administration, the Quad being Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. To be honest, it's not really directed exactly at North Korea, and that's why South Korea is really not a member of the Quad, although it coordinates with the Quad. It's designed to kind of strengthen containment of China. And that, of course, is another development in the region that I think is pushing North Korea closer to Russia. Again, as many of you know, China and North Korea formally have a very good relationship. They, you know, Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping have met. There's been, you know, obviously many decades of close fraternal relationships, but under the surface, there's a lot of tension between North Korea and China. And the major tension is around North Korea feeling dependent on China. It does not want China to be its big brother. It doesn't want China to tell it what to do. China has been pretty clear at an informal level, saying it's not happy with North Korea's nuclear status. It's not happy with the risk-taking that it sees North Korean leadership engaged in. And on the flip side, North Korea does not like to be economically dependent on China. And here we have an example of exactly how economically dependent North Korea is on China. If you look at where North Korea is getting its imports, 95.5% as of 2017. We'll see a different graph later on that updates this picture. But as of 2017, tremendous dependency on China. And that's not something that sits well with a country that values juche, which values self-sufficiency at some level. So obviously it needs China, but having a stronger relationship with Russia puts North Korea in a better strategic position to make bargains with China. So that's a strong kind of factor behind this new kind of geopolitical shift. And then, of course, U.S. China tensions, and Kumju mentioned these as well. You know, the relationship between the United States and China really deteriorated during the Trump years, but you saw signs of it in the final year or two of the Obama administration. And this has only continued into the Biden era and has gotten worse, unfortunately, especially around Taiwan. And an escalation in U.S. China tensions means more U.S. military presence, or more aggressive U.S. military presence, more obvious U.S. military presence in the region. And that is not good for inter-Korean relations, even if the focus of that is South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, because it aggravates relations between the two countries and aggravates relations with North Korea more generally. Now, with U.S.-North Korean relations, of course, we had this period of basically strategic patience, the policy of strategic patience, begun under the Obama administration, which is basically, we're just going to sit around and wait for North Korea to, quote unquote, come to its senses and come to the table and negotiate. We're not going to really offer it much. The last real offer was on the table back during the Obama administration, the leap year agreement, and that didn't last very long. And so that, was kind of continuing into the first part of the Trump administration. And then Trump decided he was going to kind of change things around completely. He was going to go face to face with Kim Jong-un. And for a brief moment there, we thought, there could be some breakthroughs here. Trump is kind of ignoring the foreign policy consensus in the United States. He's going off on his own. He's an unpredictable fellow. Maybe he will, frankly, by luck or by chance, transform the relationship between the United States and North Korea. Of course, it didn't last very long. It didn't last very long, largely because Trump didn't really understand what he was doing, didn't understand what North Korea wants and would want in the future, and thought that his own kind of personal charisma or the combination of carrots and sticks that were kind of peculiarly Trumpian would transform the situation, and it didn't. So what are we left with in this kind of post-Trump era? Well, the Biden administration engaged in a strategic review, as takes place at the beginning of any administration, and came to a conclusion that it was going to improve on strategic patience, but in fact, it's just strategic patience part 2. And that's where we are right now in U.S. DPRK negotiations. There's basically nothing going on. I suspect that there's some back channel discussions. Certainly the United States recently said that it was open to negotiations with North Korea. But to be honest with you, it doesn't look like there's much going on. And so, clearly North Korea doesn't see its closer relationship with Russia as jeopardizing anything. It's not jeopardizing its relationship with South Korea because you have a conservative government there.
Do you have any citrus fruit, oranges, grapefruits?
I think someone has their microphone on, asking for citrus fruit. I think they're not asking.
I got it. I think I got them.
Okay. So they don't feel like they're jeopardizing the relationship with South Korea. They don't feel like they're jeopardizing the relationship with the United States. There's really nothing to lose by throwing its lot in with Russia and getting closer with Moscow. And then, of course, there are the factors inside North Korea. I've talked about kind of the different trends in the region and with the United States, but there have been things happening, obviously, inside North Korea as well. Obviously, the most important would be COVID and the shutdown of borders. And North Korea has announced that it's basically, last month, it said that it had, dealt with COVID. It didn't need vaccines. It didn't need testing kits. It managed to handle the outbreak by itself. We have no idea really how many people were infected or how many people died. There were a lot of cases that were announced that were different, high fever cases or cases that were different diseases that might have been COVID. But the shutdown of the border, well, that has obvious measurable impacts. And one of those, of course, is that trade dropped to a trickle. And of course, we saw before in the earlier graph, the dependency of China, a dependency of North Korea on China. And here we see that, basically we're seeing shutdown of the border, and there's no, in this case, exports, not imports, but virtually nothing going out of North Korea during the 2020 period. Although, as you see, it was starting to decline rather rapidly between 2017 and 2018. We can talk about that in Q&A, why that happened. And the GDP, well, this is one of the major reasons why trade declined so precipitously, is because the economy wasn't growing. 2017, 2018 were very difficult years. 2020, of course, COVID year, drop of about 5.5% contraction of the economy. This is 2021. You can't really tell because it's such a thin line. It was a decline of 0.1%, I believe, contraction, a much smaller contraction, but nevertheless a contraction. So closing the borders, dealing with COVID has had a kind of profound and negative effect on the economy. Strangely, agriculture up until recently was doing okay, in part because there really weren't a lot of natural disasters last year. But of course, just recently with the flooding connected with typhoons, North Korea, of course, is in a difficult position again. And I should emphasize that, there's great regional difference between the food situation within North Korea. Obviously, the agricultural rich areas closer to the border in the south, those areas are doing pretty good. Up in the Northeast, obviously not so good. But one indication of the difficulties that North Korea is facing right now is at least one report that the government, the North Korean government, is approaching India to get rice. And here again, that's interesting. It always depended on China for its rice imports. So another indication that perhaps relationship with China is not doing very well at the moment. Okay, so those are the kind of negative trends that we're all dealing with that, that make it more difficult to imagine peace and reunification policies moving forward, either in the region or between the United States and the DPRK. And, obviously, I don't want to just focus on the less favorable trends. Let's look at the glass half full side of the equation now. Now, the first is, and as I said, the closer relationship between Russia and North Korea is not necessarily a less favorable trend. It's just an indicator of the position North Korea feels that it's in, that it has nothing to lose by moving closer to Vladimir Putin. But in some strange way, one could argue that North Korea is in a somewhat stronger position as a result of these geopolitical shifts, that it can count more on Russian assistance. It can play Russia and China off one another, as it did so rather successfully during the 1980s. So this in some ways puts North Korea in a more flexible position, at least with regard to its two historic allies. The other kind of interesting thing, and this is, puts us in a different position. I mean, obviously, the U.S. government would say this is an unfavorable trend, but for us in the peace movement, it's so clear that economic sanctions are not working. And what do I mean by economic sanctions not working? Well, of course, you could talk about the impact it has on North Korea and the North Korean economy. But what I'm focusing on here is kind of according to the stated aims of, say, the coalition that maintains sanctions against North Korea. It's so clear that they're not meeting their goals. They haven't changed North Korea's behavior. North Korea continued to basically do what it wanted to do. It continued to build up its nuclear program. And of course, just a couple of days ago, it declared itself officially a nuclear power and it said it wasn't going to give up its nuclear weapons or anything. So obviously sanctions didn't prevent that. Sanctions were relatively easy to evade. There were enough countries that were willing to work around those sanctions to get North Korea what it wanted. I mean, obviously, North Korea is not, as you saw from the economic statistics, not prospering exactly economically. But on the other hand, it hasn't collapsed. And we have not seen a change in government. If in fact, economic sanctions were designed as a regime change strategy, it didn't work. Have the same regime in place. In fact, sanctions have produced exactly the opposite of what they're intended to produce. Instead of kind of forcing North Korea to the negotiating table and making it more flexible. It's effectively forced North Korea into less flexible positions. So for instance, all of the things that the United States complains about in terms of North Korea's economic behavior, let's switch to the economic behavior at the moment, such things as engaging in drug trafficking, counterfeiting, gray market activities, variety of types. All of those are actually responses to sanctions. I mean, North Korea engages in that behavior because it doesn't have access to official economic channels. It doesn't have access to the global economy. So of course it's going to engage in gray market activities because those are the activities that it has access to. Only way of raising very difficult to raise hard currency. So in other words, the tighter the sanctions become, the more North Korea becomes a country requiring sanctions, at least again, from the point of view of the US government. So economic sanctions turn out to be self-defeating, literally self-defeating. So why I say that's favorable is that it should become obvious to all but the most intransigent that an alternative approach is necessary. Now, I know that a lot of the organizing activity here is around, for instance, ending the Korean War, getting a peace treaty, supporting the meetings of divided families, and of course, providing some humanitarian assistance to North Korea. And I think all of those are very, very valuable. What I'm going to offer, though, here in this last section, and then we can go into Q&A, is a different strategy, a strategy that perhaps is updated for the kind of geopolitical situation we face today. And we begin where social workers always tell us to begin. We begin where the other person is. I mean, you don't create an alternative out of thin air. You don't create it just out of what you want. It has to be based on what the desires are of the person you're working with. You have to know what those desires are, or else what you offer is not going to go anywhere. Obviously, if Yoon had thought a little bit about what North Korea wants, he wouldn't have offered his audacious plan. So what does North Korea want? Well, obviously, it wants greater security. It fears that it's going to be attacked. It's going to be invaded. Security more generally, I mean, the ability to kind of plan and predict with some degree of certitude, what the future will be for the government and the people. It wants more prosperity. Obviously, you saw the figures on the economy. The economy's been shrinking. It really wants to see growth in agriculture and industry. It wants acknowledgement of its global status. I mean, one of the reasons it wants nuclear weapons is not just for deterrence, obviously to prevent other countries from attacking it, but it also wants to be acknowledged as a significant power in the world. And nuclear weapons are a kind of, not an easy way, because it's not easy to get nuclear weapons, but it's kind of a pass, if you will, into the club of important nations in the world. It wants some degree of parity or even superiority over South Korea. I mean, it's tired of being compared negatively to South Korea by people saying, well, it's, the economy of North Korea is so much poorer. The level of technology is so low. I mean, North Korea bristles at that. I mean, in part because the level of technology is actually quite high in North Korea. It feels that it's competitive with South Korea in a lot of different fields, and high tech, et cetera, computers, for instance, animation. But also because, if there's ever going to be any kind of real reunification, i.e. reunification of equals, as opposed to what we saw with Germany, which was a reunification of a very strong power and a very weak power, which was called reunification, but was essentially absorption. I mean, North Korea doesn't want absorption. So to prevent absorption, of course, it wants a degree of parity or even superiority over South Korea. And then, as part of greater security, more prosperity, it needs energy. It needs energy to power its economy. And it doesn't have a lot of sources of energy. It has some coal, obviously, but it doesn't have oil and natural gas. It's heavily dependent on other countries. So that leads us, I was going to put that up higher. Of course, peace treaty is very important. But it leads us to what can we offer? And when I say we, I mean a kind of consortium of countries. What can we offer North Korea that they actually want, and that could lead to greater peace and ultimately, I would hope, greater chances of reunification of the Korean Peninsula? And that, for me, is the bigger carrot. And in this case, the bigger carrot is a clean energy carrot. So what do I mean by a clean energy carrot? And I'll just kind of finish up here. North Korea has a very small carbon footprint. That should not be very surprising to folks. I mean, obviously, it was a little bigger back in 1990, but it actually has cut its carbon emissions by over 70% since 1990. Well, and I should, add that it didn't do so voluntarily. I mean, that's a result largely of the decline of its industry and the decline of its agriculture. But in any case, at this point, North Korea has a carbon footprint that's comparable to El Salvador's. This is a per capita carbon footprint I'm talking about, and less than Tonga, the small Pacific island. In other words, it has a really small carbon footprint. You compare that with South Korea. South Korea has a huge carbon footprint, What that means is that South Korea has a lot of sunken costs in its fossil fuel infrastructure. It's very difficult for South Korea to move into sustainable energy. And we've seen that, over the last 5 years, even with the Green New Deal coming from the Moon Jae-in government, it was very difficult to move the country away from its dependency on natural gas and imported oil and move it towards solar, wind, and of course, Yoon has proposed greater nuclear energy as a way of weaning South Korea from its fossil fuels. However, and we can have that conversation later if you're interested, what it sets up is a very interesting dynamic in which North Korea does not have a lot of sunken costs in its fossil fuel infrastructure, and South Korea does have a lot of sunken costs. In other words, it's much easier for North Korea to leapfrog over current technologies to embrace new technologies, sustainable, renewable energy technologies, than it is for South Korea to do so. In other words, North Korea actually has an advantage over South Korea in this particular case. So what I'm proposing, in other words, and I'll finish up here, just exactly at half an hour, is that we think of reunification more in green terms, that North Korea and South Korea can cooperate in a way that's actually equitable, in which the two sides are in a much closer position than if we were talking about simply economic cooperation, which South Korea is way ahead of North Korea, at least in terms of size of economy. But if we're talking about adoption of clean energy, North Korea can surge ahead much more rapidly than South Korea can if it has the resources to do so. I've already said, what's North Korea looking for? Well, it's looking for energy. It's looking for a way to kind of be a world power. It could be, North Korea in this situation could be a leading player in the world in terms of clean energy if it made this leapfrog. It has an incredibly educated population. It has the technological know-how. It can do this. It lacks capital. That's what it lacks. But if the capital is provided for this clean energy leapfrog, it can do this. But how much more powerful it would be if the two Koreas did this together and in an equitable fashion, in a roughly equal fashion in which they're both participating together rather than either the absorption model or any other kind of inequitable model that has been put forward for reunification. So I'm going to leave it there and try to answer any questions you have, but really want to emphasize that this green reunification really connects, I think, in a very satisfying way with our current crisis, our current climate crisis. We all have to do this. We all countries have to make this transition. How powerful would it be if the Korean Peninsula actually showed the way for the rest of the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John,
Beautiful.
for your highly
Beautiful,
informative
beautiful.
and insightful presentation. So yeah, it was incredibly helpful in understanding the current situation of the Korean Peninsula and future prospects for peace. So I am checking the chat box for questions, and so we receive questions in the chat, and then I'm going to collect the questions, and I do my best to give all the questions as time permit. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so there are some questions regarding the economic status, the economy of North Korea in the 1970s. Okay, so one question is part of the problem that the DPRK was actually at one time more prosperous than the ROK through the 70s?
That's correct. As many of you know, North Korea was able to recover from the Korean War more rapidly than South Korea. It had obviously a state-led economic revival. And to a certain extent, South Korea did too, under very conservative regimes in the 1960s. But North Korea was more successful. And the CIA estimates that, in 1975, the two countries were more or less equal, on par economically. But then there was a rather significant divergence of the two economies. And the divergence was, for a lot of reasons, but one major reason was that South Korea became integrated into the global economy, and North Korea took a different route. Now, North Korea initially thought about doing that. It took on some loans actually from European countries with the idea perhaps of moving closer to the global economy. And when I say global economy, obviously I mean the global capitalist economy back in the 1970s. But it ultimately decided not to do that. South Korea had tremendous growth in the 1970s, late 70s and into the 1980s, obviously. Now, what kind of problems did that set up? Well, I think, North Korea had expectations that it could catch up to South Korea if given a chance to do so. And on the eve of the industrial and agricultural collapse of the country, North Korean agriculture, for instance, was the most mechanized agriculture in the region, more mechanized than South Korea, more mechanized than Japan. So by that measure, North Korean agriculture was ahead of the entire region. But of course, that also meant that it was highly vulnerable. In other words, it was very dependent on energy. Energy to run the tractors, the combines, energy to have fertilizer and large amounts of it, all of it basically fossil fuel based. And when the fossil fuel price went up tremendously, in other words, China and Russia were no longer providing it with cheaper concessionary rates on energy, North Korea is in a very difficult situation. So it's this gap between expectations and expectations that were not false expectations about economic growth and what happened in the 1990s that I think has put North Korea in a difficult position. But that isn't, that's not an eternal position. I want to remind people that, when the United States was doing an economic assessment of Asia after World War II, the report that was presented, at the very beginning it said, do not expect that Japan or South Korea will ever become developed economies. The only two countries in the region that have any hope of becoming advanced economies are the Philippines and Burma. And the reason they said that was because there were natural resources in Burma and in the Philippines. Now, of course, it was the opposite. What happened was South Korea and Japan, of course, became economic superpowers because it wasn't any longer based on natural resources. Economic growth was determined by other factors. And what I want to emphasize here is we are now in a similar situation in which economic growth can no longer be connected in any way to fossil fuels and fossil fuel inputs, which means that countries like North Korea, and not just North Korea, but countries like North Korea, have an opportunity to prosper in this new economy. But in order to do so, they have to have the capital, in some cases intellectual capital, in other cases finance, to make that leap.
All right. Thank you so much for the answer. And we have really great questions here. One of them is about the possibility of reunification between the U.S. between two Koreas without U.S. intervening. So if North and South Korea had the option to reunify without the U.S. intervening, and how would they resolve their different political systems?
Well, yes. I mean, I think ideally, if we're thinking of an ideal situation, of course, the two Koreas reunify without the assistance of any other country. I mean, other than, the other countries saying they're not going to intervene in the affairs on the Korean Peninsula. That's the ideal situation. However, we're not in an ideal situation. Of course, we have a very conservative South Korean government, which is not really interested in any kind of reunification, either slow motion reunification that we saw under, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, and to a certain extent Moon Jae-in, or even, be honest with you, an absorption version of reunification, simply because I think a lot of conservatives in South Korea are worried about the financial costs and risks of an absorption scenario, unless, of course, the North Korean government were to collapse and South Korea felt it had to do something. All of which is to say that at the moment, the United States is a useful partner for a couple of reasons. One, because the United States obviously is very influential in determining sanctions, determining access to global capital and financing, and in kind of the general security situation in Northeast Asia because of the presence of US troops. I mean, those are just facts, and they're very difficult to overcome. And at the same time, the United States is actually very useful as a problem. I mean, the United States is useful for North Korea as an adversary that is, constantly put out there as threatening North Korea and therefore leading to, the need to have certain types of policies within North Korea. So the United States is useful as a boogeyman in the same way that North Korea is useful as a boogeyman in US politics. I think also the US can be useful in South Korean politics as well, but that's a longer answer. Again, to conclude the answer to this important question, ideally, yes. I think Koreans should be the ones who just determine the path of reunification. But the way that geopolitics is now, you have to factor in the United States at some level. My opinion is it's best if you can reduce the US role to a certain level. It's probably not going to be possible to completely eliminate it.
Okay, great answer. So it's very hopeful. Yeah. There is a great question. Okay. To what extent was the recent electoral results in South Korea based on the current president's less favorable stance regarding North Korea?
That's a hard question. And I would defer to our South Korean audience members to answer that question, because I mean, I think certainly there was some disappointment among certainly conservative voters with the position the Moon Jae-in government took. And of course, he didn't satisfy all progressive voters either. They were disappointed that the Moon Jae-in government didn't go further with its engagement policies with the North. So, this is a case of damned if you do and damned if you don't in South Korean politics and North Korea. I think ultimately, there are going to be stronger domestic reasons why a conservative is going to be chosen in South Korea, having to do with the response to COVID, the nature of the South Korean economy and how it was recovering from COVID. There are going to be other domestic factors that probably are going to count more than the respective candidates' position on North Korea.
Okay, great. And what wasn't the main reason the illegal blockade on DPRK, which prevents from the international trade?
Well, certainly the sanctions make it very difficult for North Korea to engage in the global economy. I mean, that is a major reason. But as I said, back in the 1970s, North Korea did engage to a certain degree with capitalist countries by taking out loans from European governments. It, of course, saw a reduction to a certain extent of sanctions during the agreed framework period, when it did get closer to the global economy, though obviously didn't enter the global economy. But I think the underlying question here is, does the economic fate of North Korea depend entirely on the blockade or on the sanctions? And there I'd say, well, yes. I mean, clearly economic progress, there's a ceiling to it in terms of the ability of North Korea to prosper economically in that kind of situation. However, I think there are other factors that are internal that determine North Korea's economic progress or lack of progress, because we've seen that it has, under the same circumstances of an economic blockade, in some years done well and in other years hasn't done well. And so we do have to find other factors for determining North Korean economic success.
Okay, so there is a question about Korea's reunification in the case, considering the case of the German reunification. So is South Korea wary because of the example of the German problems in reunification?
Well, obviously South Korea and South Koreans know about what happened in Germany. And I think the actual price tag of German reunification is scary. I mean, it's scary for folks in South Korea, especially because, Helmut Kohl with German reunification basically, as we say, lowballed or provided a much lower figure for the cost of reunification than he knew at the time, and also that it turned out to be. I mean, German reunification was extraordinarily expensive. And, when you do polling in South Korea, constantly this issue comes up, especially among young people who say, I don't know about anything connected to North Korea. And I obviously I'm not of the generation that's connected to the Korean War or anything connected to North Korea. All I can think about is how much it would cost me as a young person if reunification went forward. And I, as a young person, am not willing to spend all that much money for reunification going forward, if it means that my life will be less prosperous. So that's a common sentiment you hear in polling in South Korea. It's not every young person, obviously, but it is strong among a certain sector of young people. So that's obviously partly an understanding of what happened in Germany. And on the North Korean side, of course, what the North Koreans see is that there was formally a process of reunification that was equal, that allowed the two Germans to talk about their future together. But what really happened was East Germany was abolished as a country. And I don't mean East Germany, communist East Germany. I mean, because that was abolished, but that was abolished by the East Germans themselves. It was that 10-month period in which East Germany was a democratic country. This was from the elections of March of 1990 through till October and reunification of the country. And that was abolished. So that country disappeared, and it disappeared. That meant that a democratic parliament was eliminated. That meant that democratic citizens were not listened to. That meant that their entire industry was wiped out as West German firms went in and bought up all of these cheap properties. North Korea knows all about that, and it knows that it does not want that to happen to itself. Even if formally South Korea and North Korea are talking to each other, they know that there's an imbalance of power between North Korea and South Korea. They know that chaebols from South Korea could swoop in and buy up everything, land, infrastructure, everything, with very little cost to the chaebols, and North Korean influence would disappear like that. So I think there's reason for North Koreans and the North Korean government to be very worried about a reunification plan that looks, equal, but in fact is not equal at all.
That was a great answer. I learned a lot. And actually, there are so many great questions we have to cover. I just picked some of them. Sorry, I cannot really give all the questions. What would be our best strategy in approaching the current State Department in looking toward the different new Korea policy, not the old one, many of them developed. And on top of this question, I'd like to add then how can Americans support North Korea?
Okay, two questions. First, State Department, and second, kind of us, American people. What do we do? State Department, I mean, if you talk to folks in the State Department, to be honest with you, they won't say this publicly, but they're frustrated too. I mean, they don't think that strategic patience has worked as a strategy. They don't think that economic sanctions necessarily have worked as a strategy. They too would like to see a different policy, but State Department, the experts, they don't run that policy. I mean, it's run by Secretary of State to a certain extent and by the president. And right now, North Korea is not high on the priority list. I mean, high on the priority list is Russia, China, and North Korea is pretty far down. In terms of approaching the State Department, however, I would say, emphasizing the importance of cooperation, any type of cooperation. Now, when we're talking about China, there was, and there continues to be at a certain level, U.S.-Chinese cooperation on climate issues. And, I think it's important for all of us who are concerned about the Korean Peninsula to really, play up, to say we support greater cooperation between the United States and China on climate change issues. I think we can add, we should cooperate with North Korea as well on climate change. It doesn't matter, what the Biden administration thinks about nuclear weapons. It doesn't matter what they think about Kim Jong-un. It doesn't matter what they think about Juche. What matters is we face a crisis right now that is urgent, and we have to work with everybody on this issue. And that includes North Korea. Okay, we as Americans, what can we do? Well, that's hard. I mean, obviously, Peace Action has a great program for how to support a bill in Congress, how to talk to your representatives about providing greater humanitarian assistance, allowing people to travel to North Korea, pushing for family reunification talks, which I should add, South Korea just recently proposed. We don't know whether North Korea will respond. So I think as American citizens, we have to push for that. But I also think we have to push for new thinking. I mean, we have to say, look, these conflicts that we've been talking about are basically Cold War conflicts. They belong to a failed era of human interaction that does not work. It does not work for dealing with our problems now. What are our problems now? Our problems are climate change, pandemics, biodiversity loss, etc. We have to cooperate on these. There's no way of going it alone on any of these issues. So as Americans, I think we have to emphasize that over and over and over again. There is a role for cooperation, even between people who disagree strongly and on ideological grounds.
There is a very interesting question regarding demonization of North Korea. Actually, I have had this question for a long time. So most Americans I know absolutely believe that the North Korean people are brainwashed to worship their leader. What are your thoughts about this and how to respond to this propaganda?
Yeah. Well, I mean, usually how I respond is I tell people, look, your average North Korean is just like you. They're just trying to get through the day. They have problems. They have problems at their job. They have problems in their family. Yeah, they live in perhaps somewhat more difficult situation. Obviously, there's a food crisis. There's, you know, not exactly a democratic society that they're living in. So perhaps they face additional problems, but they are just ordinary folks who are facing these problems. On the question of propaganda and brainwashing, well, yeah, I mean, there's brainwashing in every country. There's propaganda in every country. I mean, do you really think here in the United States that the 2020 election was stolen? Well, a lot of people in this country believe that. So are they brainwashed? Have they accepted the propaganda? Well, not of the government, obviously, but of Donald Trump and his followers? Well, it seems that they have. So you're going to have a group of folks in every country around the world that, you know, believes things that are not true. But you cannot construct policy with those people in mind. I mean, when people are constructing policy toward the United States, are they thinking, well, should we construct a policy that takes into consideration that, you know, the entire Republican Party is crazy? Well, no, probably they don't. They have to work with what they have, which is the Biden administration, and they put off to one side the fact that the Republican Party is crazy. I think you have to do the same with North Korea. Okay, there are some elements there that are, you know, difficult to deal with. You put those to one side and you say, we work with whom we can work with. And that means people-to-people exchanges. That means organization-to-organization exchanges. And where it is possible, cooperation that's intergovernmental. And you, in some sense, put this question of demonization aside. You put this question of propaganda and brainwashing aside. You say, well, yeah, it exists, it doesn't exist, but in fact, it's not relevant. It's not relevant to the issues we have to deal with today.
Yeah, absolutely true. Actually, I went to Korea 3 years ago and I interacted with just ordinary North Korean people there. They're just like me and like us, okay? They are not demons. All right, so they're really great questions. Many great questions, but I just have to pick one of them. So this is about the U.S. Militarism. So why is the U.S. so committed to global military hegemony when it is so expensive? Is military hegemony necessary for the U.S. to dominate the global finance system?
That's a hard question. But I mean, obviously, I don't agree with U.S. global military hegemony, either in the military side or on the economic side. But here's the rationale that I think the government, or at least some government officials, ascribe to. And that is that, that our way of life here in the United States is dependent on our global hegemony. In other words, you know that our carbon footprint is much larger than anybody else's in the world, including those of the people who live in Europe, who, you know, are just as developed economically, if you like, as we are here in the United States. But the US carbon footprint is enormous, and our per capita carbon footprint is enormous. We consume an enormous amount. We consume more than we should. And in order to preserve that inequality, well, we have to control the financial system. We have to make sure that the dollar is the currency of trade throughout the world. If it weren't, then our enormous debt would be called in. And if our debt were called in, well, we would be treated like any other country that went into debt default, Argentina or Uganda or any other country around the world. We would be subjected to strong medicine, as the IMF says. We would be forced to cut our economic programs, our government programs. We would be forced to reduce our standard of living. In other words, and I think this is kind of realpolitik from the US government's point of view. In order to sustain our unsustainable lifestyle here in the United States, we have to maintain global military and economic hegemony. It might cost a lot, but it costs a lot less than if we were subjected to structural adjustment along the lines of what the IMF does to other countries. So how do we get out of that, which would be the kind of corollary question? We have to, as a people, reduce our consumption and reduce our carbon footprint. We have to become more sustainable with the world. And only by doing that can we, in fact, reduce the need to maintain global military and economic hegemony. In other words, I'm kind of flipping the equation. Of course, we must, campaign against the military industrial complex, campaign against Lockheed Martin, campaign against all of that, yes. But at the root of it, it's what that protects that we have to address. And that's on us. That's, community by community, we have to address these issues of unsustainability.
All right, great. So I wanted to give all the questions, but with our limited time, I'm afraid I have to miss some of the questions. So today's webinar is aimed at understanding the situation on the Korean Peninsula and contributing to the path to peace. So it's time to take actions. HR 3446, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, was introduced in the House in May 2021. This bill is very important for promoting peace on the Korean Peninsula. It mainly includes the end of the Korean War and the signing of a peace treaty. So as of today, there are 43 co-sponsors for HR 3446, and we are collecting signatures from people to urge representatives to co-sponsor the bill and eventually pass it in the House. So we share the link to the petition for the bill in the chat. Please check it out and visit the Korea Peace website and scroll down to where it says urge your member of Congress to support peace in Korea to send your representative a letter urging them to become a co-sponsor. Your participation and support will be of great help in making peace on the Korean Peninsula. I think it's time to wrap up our webinar today. Thank you again, John, for sharing your in-depth knowledge and insights. This has been a rich and productive webinar. And thank you to all the participants for joining the webinar tonight and for your support for Korea Peace. Bye now. Good night.